Good evening. Well, welcome. Welcome to Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. My name is Soo-Yeon Park, the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean. And I'm delighted that you have joined us for this second joyful collaboration between Union and the LGBT Religious Archives Network. Last year was our first collaboration, and we're delighted to invite you for a second year in a row. To begin our evening, allow me to bring a few words of Virginia Ramey Mollenkott here into this space. This selection is from her 2006 reflections entitled Neither Male Nor Female: Understanding the Complexities of Sex and Gender. And I quote, "What society has constructed, society can also deconstruct and reconstruct. The goal is worthwhile: to learn from the facts of human sexuality and genderedness, and to develop attitudes that match those facts and thus alleviate human pain. Although I have written books arguing human equality of females and males and homosexuals and heterosexuals, I now understand that no matter how liberationist the context may be, as long as these terms are handled in a binary fashion, they continue to reinforce the dominant gender paradigm." Union community, supporters, and friends, I extend a warm welcome to the Virginia Ramey Mollenkott Award ceremony. This evening, we honor those who, in the practice of Mollenkott, deconstruct and reconstruct in liberatory fashion beyond the binary. Specifically, this evening, we celebrate Austin Steelman, the 2024 Mollenkott Awardee, and we welcome back Dr. Wallace Best, the 2023 Mollenkott Awardee. Here at Union, we have a long and varied, rich history of LGBTIQ advocacy, study, theology, and justice, both in the larger public sphere as well as in the churches. And now we're expanding toward other religious traditions and non-religious traditions as well. Our history expands decades, and we're committed to building and rebuilding and reconstructing on our legacy. So allow me to highlight two exciting courses we're offering this year. One was offered in January, and one currently being offered: Living Practices of Gender, Sexuality, Justice, Embodying Queer Theology. It was taught by Dr. Kathy Talvakia, and Queer Anglicanism with Reverend Dr. Patrick Cheng. And our Center for Community Engagement and Social Justice is focusing their programming toward June for LGBTIQ Pride Month. We will be celebrating Union community's queer history and activism with interviews and conversations featuring stories of our involvement in this struggle, HIV/AIDS communal care and activism, and hard histories as well, bringing progressive religious voices to this fight. We'll be documenting stories told and untold of students, alums, faculty, staff, and friends who have given their lives to this work and continue to give their lives to this work. We're shaping an expansive, queer, non-binary, love-centered, present and future, informed by our past. I am grateful for all of you here this evening, and a special shout out to all the organizers, Mark Bauman, Brandon Nee, our Queer Caucus, and others. for planning this wonderful event. And thank you all for braving the weather, for what is a little bit of rain, a little bit of water, right? You remind us that gratitude, honoring legacy, and holding ceremony must be a part of the revolution. Friends, a wonderful evening is planned before us. We're delighted to honor Austin Steelman as the Virginia Ramey Mollenkott Awardee this evening. Congratulations and welcome to Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York.
I bring you greetings from the staff of LGBTQ-RAN and also the Board of Directors. I'm Marnie Warner, Chair of the Board of Directors, and I was also going to acknowledge that you all made it through the rain. But we also want to thank everybody who's coming in virtually, which are about 60 people who are coming virtually and didn't have to come through the rain. But you all get gold stars. If I were in kindergarten, I'd be giving you gold stars for showing up. We have a big expression of gratitude to Union Theological Seminary, Dean Pack, the Queer Caucus, and the seminary staff who've been so gracious in their hospitality and in co-hosting this presentation of the Virginia Ramey Mollenkott Award. LGBTQ-RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ-RAN folks and religious movements around the world. LGBT-RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. And do remember that. A lot of people don't get that we're digital only. However, we do advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records and in appropriate physical archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBT-RAN and LGBTQ+ persons and groups from a wide range of religious expressions around the world. And truly, we want to expand, and we're not talking about all just traditional religions. So if there's places that you see that are gaps in what we have on the website, email Mark, and maybe we can fill them in. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. One of the primary ways we encourage scholarship is through this annual award for papers. Since its initiation in 2005, 15 different scholars have been awarded the LGBTQ-RAN Award over the years. This is the only award given for outstanding research and writing in queer religious history. We were thrilled last year when the award was named for Virginia Ramey Mollenkott, Ph.D., who was a renowned lesbian, trans feminist, Christian scholar, and an advocate for 4 decades until her death in September 2020. In collaboration with Dr. Mollenkott's close friends and families, we established this award as a permanent memorial to her legacy, to her courageous witness and profound impact upon the lives of countless LGBTQ+ people, their families, and their friends. It is so fitting tonight that we have the opportunity to continue to honor Virginia, as well as to honor the second scholar to receive the Mollenkott Award. So again, thank you for coming. And after the program, Brendan Fay, where's Brendan? Did I lose him? He's back there. Mark Bowman, who you've met, and I are willing to answer any questions about LGBTQ-RAN, its mission, and how you can get involved. And again, thank you for being here through the rain.
Hello. Hi. I'm Caro, any pronouns. I'm a librarian here at Union and Columbia, and I'd like to say a few words about queer religious archives. So, people often come to the library and the archives seeking firsts, the original documents of our queer legends, like who was the first queer student at Union. Supporting this research is part of the broader work of librarians, archivists, and organizations like LGBTQ-RAN that bring us together. Seasoned researchers, though, even the ones who thirst for firsts, know that we don't keep archives in folders marked gays and folders marked lesbians and trans people and cis people. That would get out of hand. But of course I understand what they're looking for. We as queer people hunger for our history. And the importance of LGBTQ archives, especially in religion, our traditions, our spiritualities, cannot be overstated. And we must uplift especially the archival work, and it is work, that organizes and preserves the stories of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are still underrepresented in the archive. And I myself cannot help but think often these days of the libraries and archives that have been destroyed in Gaza as part of the ongoing violence there, the material record of a people. And we must support the work, and it is work, that preserves and makes accessible the material record of our shared past. The queer firsts that researchers come to this library to seek are our heroes, the trailblazers, the ones who fight for our rights, who threw the first brick. We want to know our history of our queer selves, and yet we must also question our motivations and the role of our own ego when we try too hard to only find ourselves in the archive. In her genre-bending memoir, My Autobiography of Carson McCullers, Jen Shapland writes about exploring the archives of, shall we say, an author with a lot of close female friends. And she struggles with her desire to identify with her subject. She writes, "I was a queer person looking for a role model, but I looked to everyone I met as a role model. I was in my mid-20s. We can acknowledge and forgive our biases, of course. Our searches for ourselves in the archives are understandable. These efforts have yielded rich narratives about queer histories that have long been suppressed. Yet we must also seek stories of those we don't look to as role models, and of course I am talking here about evil gays." Yes. Austin's piece, which we honor tonight, reminds us that villains can be just as important to our shared LGBTQ religious identity as our trailblazing heroes. And there is a podcast dedicated to this very subject called Bad Gays, which explores evil and complicated queers like Alexander the Great, J. Edgar Hoover, and New York's own George Santos. The hosts, historians Ben Miller and Hugh Lemmy, assert in their book that, unlike our heroes, we rarely remember bad gays as gay. And yet their sexuality was just as important an influence on their lives as those whom we celebrate. And their stories have much to tell us about how the sexual identities we understand today came to exist. And Austin's paper forces us to ask, what does it mean if one of our gay forebears was a contributing source of a theology of hatred and other phobia that would one day drive a person or many people to commit homophobic and transphobic hate crimes? What if our gay forebear did that, within or outside of the closet? The trope of conservative religious queers in the closet comes from a trend of leaders projecting their own self-denial outward into public hatred. Ted Haggard comes to mind. And this has huge ramifications for queer life. The silence of the closet is one of the most terrifying things about it, not to mention its effects of unqueering the church and the seminary community. Last year, Professor Wallace Best, received the Mollenkott Award for his paper on Clarence Cobb's Everybody Knew He Was That Way, an incredible Black church leader existing in what Dr. Best terms the glass closet. And I don't want to give too many spoilers before Austin, but there's a part where the story of the life of J. Gresham Machen hinges on a hugely significant letter he sent to his family. And we know about the letter because of his family's reply, but the letter itself has been lost to history. And here he cites Trujillo that any historical narrative is a particular bundle of silences. Much of the labor that goes into archival work, and it is work, is to organize, give structure to untold vastness of information of which we as librarians and archivists are the label-making stewards. And this sacred act of organizing is to give names to the unnamed, like Adam gave names to the animals in Genesis. So what label, then, do we give the folder of gays, if we make one? The terms we use to describe sexuality today were only invented in the last couple of centuries and were shaped hegemonically within the context of Western, predominantly white, Christocentric, European, and American colonial powers. And while they illuminate certain stories, they also function to silence other ways of being queer. So what do I do at my library when someone asks me for gay firsts? There are some who say that the first out queer student at Union was Howard Wells, an MCC minister in the 70s and 80s. Come on, Union students. But these are folks who knew him as a friend. They didn't learn about him by going to the archives. Howard Wells' name hasn't come up in any of the files I've seen here in Union's library, only in conversation. And you can find information about Howard Wells on the LGBTQ-RAN website. But we and the people who are dear to us are, in a sense, each of us, a queer archive of each other. And there are positive visions to be found, I think, in a queering of our notions of what it means to find something in an archive. And this task is particularly suitable for queer theology. At the seminary, we're used to grappling with what can't be seen by the naked eye and what doesn't fit neatly into discrete categories and binaries. Whereas the archive has long been viewed as a place to give order, to have a structured journey towards the truths one seeks, towards finding ourselves in a stable narrative of identity. Perhaps one of the projects of the Queer Archive, as Queer Archive historian Eric Colleary writes, is the destabilizing, energizing, eroticizing of the personal narratives of our subjects, in the interest of complicating the idea that our past can be known, the willingness to unearth unexpected narratives, and the joy of embracing different ways of knowing. We must examine those figures whose queerness, while not documented or photographed, nonetheless shaped their impact on queer culture and society. And instead of turning a colorblind eye toward the impact of race, we must examine critically how white supremacy shapes the designs of our viewpoints and of queer culture itself. Crucially, most crucially, we need work that challenges the notion that LGBTQ life and spiritual life are irreconcilable. They're not. And we need visible stories, like what LGBTQ-RAN curates, of people whose existence is a testament to queer faith, even if the arcs of those stories aren't always exactly as we'd wish them to be. And there's certainly more queer history that isn't written down than there is in the archive. But that doesn't mean we can't unearth new stories in the materials we do preserve. And in the current political climate, it's more urgent than ever that we do preserve such materials and that we do unearth new stories and that we do say gay in the face of violence and say bisexual and say transgender and say polyamorous and say so in books, which we must have in schools and libraries. So do come to the library. Do seek these narratives in the archives and on the LGBTQ-RAN website, because we must narrate our own experiences of ourselves and our fierce love for one another, even if such love defies categorization. Each of us is a queer first. We are all valid. We all have the right to exist in the archives of our mutual interconnectedness, even the gay villains. Thank you.
Where did Carol go? There. Thank you, Carol, and thank you for your work. Good evening. My name is William Stelle. I'm a faculty fellow in the Department of Religious Studies at New York University, where I teach courses on American religions. I got to learn about Virginia Ramey Mollenkott through the research for my dissertation and first book project, And it is a privilege to share with you this evening just a bit about Mollenkott's life, faith, writing, and activism. If you're interested in learning more, after I share just a bit, you can find an excellent oral history interview of Virginia Ramey Mollenkott on LGBTQ-RAN's website, both an audio recording and a written transcript. As a prefatory note, I'll be using they, them pronouns for Virginia Ramey Mollenkott. In the later years of their life, right, they expressed a comfortability with he, him, and she, her, and they, them pronouns. So there's no wrong answer. I'll be using they, them pronouns. Now, just as Machen was no ordinary man, as Austin shows us, Mollenkott was no ordinary person. While many of the challenges and dangers that Mollenkott faced in their life will be familiar to many queer and trans religious people, I do think that what Mollenkott had to overcome from childhood on was extraordinarily severe. We're not going to linger on these matters for too long, but if we were to give even a brief biography of Mollenkott and pass over them without mention, then it would feel to me like it would at least risk dishonoring their story. So, Mollenkott was born in Philadelphia in 1932 and raised in a Plymouth Brethren congregation. If you're unfamiliar with that tradition, this is a fundamentalist Christian movement whose co-founder, John Nelson Darby, is often called the father of dispensationalism. Mollenkott's father deserted their family when they were 9 years old. Mollenkott's mother was emotionally, physically, sexually abusive. It seemed that there was no safe space for this female-bodied child who had always identified with boys. At age 11, the closest thing that Mollenkott had to a safe space was a romantic relationship with a young woman in their church. When Mollenkott's mother discovered the relationship, she shipped her child off to a private Christian school in Florida. She also told the school's administrators about her child's relationship, which led the school's administrators to instruct all of their students that no one was ever to be alone with Virginia. Under these circumstances, at age 13, Virginia began planning a suicide. Another student discovered and intervened, then told the administrators, who put Mollenkott in a sick bay at the school and forced them to read a booklet about the devil. Mollenkott was saved, they would say, by faith and by a few friendships and by literature. After graduating from this private Christian school in Florida, they attended Bob Jones University, yes, that Bob Jones University, where they fell madly in love with studying John Milton. Mollenkott didn't exactly fall madly in love with the man who would become their husband, Fred, but at the time, marriage seemed proper, if not necessary, to them. Meanwhile, Mollenkott got a master's degree in English at Temple University, then a Ph.D. in English at New York University, meanwhile teaching at a Christian college in New Jersey, then a Christian college in New York, meanwhile also raising their son, Paul. In 1967, at age 35, Mollenkott took a job teaching English at a public university in New Jersey, William Patterson, where they would teach for the duration of their career. And it was taking that job, that is, it was leaving Christian higher education, that allowed Mollenkott to get a divorce without losing their job. And it would be at that point that things really took off for Mollenkott. In that same year, in 1967, their first book was published. It would be the first of 13 books that they would publish, along with dozens and dozens of articles. Up until 1978, most of their writing appeared in self-identified evangelical publications, Christianity Today, Word Books, etc. We'll get to the significance of that year, 1978, in a second. Mollenkott wrote on many topics, on English literature, to be sure, on biblical hermeneutics, on Christian theology, on higher education, but their most impactful work was in the field of gender, sexuality, and Christianity. In the 1970s, Mollenkott helped to found an evangelical feminist movement, at the time often called biblical feminism. And in the years to come, they would contribute to a much broader Christian feminist movement. Mollenkott keynoted the inaugural Evangelical Women's Caucus Conference in 1975. 2 years after that, Mollenkott carved out what was the cutting edge of evangelical feminism with their book, Women, Men, and the Bible. And in the early 80s, Mollenkott co-authored a groundbreaking inclusive language lectionary for the National Council of Churches, a lectionary that led Mollenkott to receive a death threat. One of Mollenkott's books had a disproportionate impact on their own life. In 1978, Harper and Row published a book that Mollenkott co-authored with Letha Dawson-Scansoni called Is the Homosexual My Neighbor? Another Christian View. It was the first major book dedicated to persuading evangelical Christians and other Christians, but there is certainly a focus toward evangelical Christians. First major book dedicated to persuading them to regard homosexuality as a natural phenomenon and to affirm same-sex unions. To borrow from Austin's article, we could say that Mollenkott grew up with Machen's unqueered evangelical theology, but in this book began the work of re-queering it. Is the Homosexual My Neighbor was the crowning achievement of an evangelical gay activist network that formed over the course of the 1970s, and the book's initial reception within numerous evangelical circles was surprisingly warm. Before long, however, evangelical leaders plotted a backlash against Mollenkott. The invitations to speak at their colleges and conferences ceased. Mollenkott's article submissions to evangelical periodicals for which they had long written suddenly stopped getting accepted. Any future book proposals for an evangelical publisher would no longer get a second glance. The abandonment was painful for Mollenkott. These had been their spiritual homes. But they made spiritual homes elsewhere for decades to follow. Spiritual homes with Christian feminism today, with Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual, also known as WATER, with the National Council of Churches, with the Metropolitan Community Churches, with the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And in the last 2 decades of their life, Mollenkott also made a spiritual home in early transgender Christian circles. One of Mollenkott's last books, titled Omnigender, A Trans-Religious Approach, won the 2002 Lambda Literary Award in the category of bisexual/transgender literature. A lot has changed since 2002, when Mollenkott won that award. And although Mollenkott's way of talking about trans identity in that book, Omnigender, looks pretty different from the way most people who talk about trans identity today, the book and Mollenkott are nonetheless they nonetheless helped to trailblaze trans activism, religious and otherwise. One of my former professors, not the one who's sitting right here, one of my former professors often tells his students, don't let your historical subjects become heroes. It is not bad advice. But I have to say that in the process of doing research on Mollenkott, I found it awful hard to follow. Because how could I not root for this person, right? How could we not celebrate this queer and trans religious leader who somehow read and wrote and spoke their way into liberation? Thankfully, for our purposes this evening, the celebratory need not be withheld. And based on the large amount of time I have spent with Mollenkott's archive, I have spent a large amount of time with Mollenkott's archive. And based on the small amount of time I've spent in dialogue with Mollenkott himself, I am confident, Austin, that if Mollenkott were to read this article, Austin, they would be delighted and would be very pleased to see it win an award with their name attached to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Caro and William, for really laying a context for what we've all come to see and hear tonight. I'm Mark Bowman. I'm subbing for Gil Frank. Gil sends his regrets because of a family illness. Gil is on the jury for the Mollenkott Award, which read the papers that were submitted. As already been alluded, back in 2005, just a few years after we began the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, someone suggested we should do an award for papers. And so we began in 2005 to recognize outstanding research and scholarship in LGBTQ religious history. As already been mentioned last year, this award was named for Virginia Ramey Mollenkott, and an endowment fund was set up to perpetuate this award. If Gil were here, he would tell you that for an award-winning paper, the jury looks for scholarship that centers queer subjects, that offers compelling archival and textual evidence, that shows change over time, that analyzes religious and sexual historical contexts, and makes innovative interventions in the field. From the 8 papers submitted for the Mollenkott Award this year, the paper that best met those high expectations was Not an Ordinary Man, J. Gresham Machen and the Unqueering of Evangelical Theology by Austin Steelman. Austin, come forward. Thank you. Photo op. Austin's a Ph.D. student at Stanford University. You can read more about his bio and his paper there on the program. But now we have a unique opportunity to hear last year's Mollenkott Award winner, Wallace Best, interview Austin about Austin's research and this particular paper. So I'm very pleased to welcome Wallace and Austin here to speak to us tonight.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Caro. Thank you, William. It's a delight for me to be here. I think I remember writing in the email, this is the quickest yes I've given all week. So when I was asked to do this, I was so thrilled to do it. And then I read the paper. Wow. Austin, congratulations. Not an Ordinary Man, J. Gresham Machen and the Unqueering of Evangelical Theology. Absolutely fantastic. This paper, challenging in some ways, encouraging in some ways, deeply historical, and I got a sense that this is onto something. This paper is onto something big. Congratulations, well deserved. I wanted to start just with the question, who was J. Gresham Machen and why is he so important in the history of evangelicalism? I mean, I want to start with that basic question because he carries so much weight, the weight of so much significance in this paper. You suggest him as one, if not the principal shaper of a certain understanding of evangelicalism and evangelical theology. And there's something about the paper, there's a kind of things could have been different feel to this paper, given Machen's significance. So maybe we can just start there. Take us to, if you can fold in, why you were drawn to this man, this topic, what raised your, should we call it suspicions or whatever it was, that there was something else going on in the story of J. Gresham Machen. So start there.
Sure. So I came to this paper actually in the process of a dissertation. I didn't think I was going to be writing an article on queer religious history. I was working on a dissertation connecting biblical and constitutional interpretation on the evangelical right. Mm-hmm. So I was interested really in questions of religion and politics, religion and law, and this led me eventually to Machen for his political and theological influence. Many historians of evangelicalism have pointed out how influential he was in the 1920s during what's known as the fundamentalist modernist controversy, where Machen is the premier intellectual for the fundamentalist side. When the New York Times wants to cite a fundamentalist, they cite Machen. He's viewed as the sort of scholarly, he's a Princeton Theological Seminary professor, the sort of scholarly fundamentalist. And importantly, there's all these strains within American fundamentalism. Machen's strain really becomes the dominant one for what we now call evangelicalism. Mm-hmm. Many of his students, Harold Ockenga in particular, who was the pastor at Park Street, is known as Mr. Evangelical, co-founds the National Association of Evangelicals, is a student of Machen's, cites his books as the most influential in the Bible he's ever read. Christianity Today magazine is named after a previous magazine in which Machen was the most common author, with the same name, by L. Nelson Bell, Billy Graham's father-in-law, who was an admiring fan. Francis Schaeffer, who's a key religious right figure, is a Machen student. It's really a sort of wild and intellectual history. You don't rarely get these clean genealogies that are so far-reaching, but Machen has one of those. And his work, especially his 1923 book, Christianity and Liberalism, really crystallizes this argument of two directions that he sees for both Christianity and American politics.
And you portray this influence as ongoing. This is not something located in the past. Machen still has an imprint. Is that where you...
Absolutely. His book is still taught in evangelical seminary. Christianity and liberalism is really still taught now, sometimes specifically, but really the arguments don't move all that much. He's early on claiming biblical inerrancy as a sort of watershed for what is Christianity and what he would say is not Christianity, is liberalism, is something else. Later, secular humanism becomes the sort of primary punching bag for the alternative. But really, this argument he stakes out really is dominant within evangelicalism, really to the present day. And sometimes it's the literal words that are still being taught, and sometimes Machen's held out as this example of a rigorous intellectual who's also a believer in inerrancy. So Machen has this special place where there aren't many people from the 1920s who evangelicals still want to claim. And Machen is one of those figures. So also has this outsized sort of founding figure status as well.
But he had a crisis.
Yes.
There was a crisis
yes.
that he faced.
There is.
We have to talk about that crisis and the context of that crisis too, because I would love for you to describe the theological and sexual world in which Machen experienced this crisis, because context is crucial for you in this article, right? So you describe early 20th century Germany as a curious and significantly expectant time to be confused about one's theology and sexuality, right? So there are theological transformations in sexuality and sexual cultures, and Machen is caught up in all of this. So it is a really, really maybe a good or terrible time to be in crisis about one's theology or one's sexuality. Describe the context.
So this is the thing that really helped make this worth writing about in the end, really, because for a while you asked about inklings. For a while I was reading this, I was reading some other biographers who described in what may be familiar euphemisms for some about him having an underdeveloped romantic sense, about him being close to his mom, not forming close female attachments, in ways that are just, right, the sort of, the sort of alert goes off in your head, like, this is an interesting thing. So already I was at a point where, and I'll be honest, I would have taken some pleasure to have had this footnote to poke at some homophobic readers to be like, maybe this should be an open question, right? This is something that none of these biographers have thought about his sexuality. Maybe this is worth thinking about. Maybe we should treat this as an open historical question. And then I got deeper in the archive, and the question started to seem a little less open with each piece of evidence that emerged. But when I realized, and I will say, and what William didn't mention is that this article wouldn't have been written but for a conversation with him pushing me to write this at a conference in which I brought up some of this evidence and then sent a frantic email from the airport with some of the evidence, asking him if it made sense, and started to write this. But actually, it was in researching some of this that the context made the stakes clear, where I said, okay, maybe I want to dig in a little more. And what I particularly came to see was, and this is where I was lucky to lean on many scholars of queer history who've worked in a transnational context, that Germany was a unique place to be in grad school education at the time. Mm-hmm. And I already knew this theological story. German higher ed is the premier higher education in the world. That includes for theology. German liberalism is the sort of best of Protestant education in the early 20th century. Many of the top faculty are going, in many fields in the humanities and theology, are going to Germany to get graduate school training there. Mm-hmm. And so when Machen goes there, and I knew this, he has this theological crisis. But as I'm reading some of this queer history, I'm also realizing that Germany is a unique place in early 20th century for emerging ideas. And this term homosexuality exists in German literature, is a concept that the German press, the German public is starting to work with in a way that the United States isn't. Even though there are still sort of gay scenes that are beginning to emerge, they're not talked about or understood in nearly as a robust way as they are in Germany. And then I started to get into this dense patch of correspondence from his time in Germany. And when I realized that his theological crisis, where he seems drawn to this German liberalism, very different than the Calvinist training he'd had at Princeton Seminary, and begins to talk about what he calls his moral fault that prevents him from the ministry at the same time, was then I realized that these weren't two separate parts of Machen's story. Mm-hmm. And by extension, they're not two separate parts of the history of evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm. He had a crush on Wilhelm, let's just face it. Wilhelm, you all but say that. But he was really taken with, taken with the theology, right? There was this moment, I mean, again, there was something about this that said, this could have gone a different way for Machen, actually. He seemed to be, almost persuaded to be a Christian, almost persuaded to be a liberal. There's something attractive about it at this particular moment, but he does not get there, he cannot get there.
I mean, there's really this moment of, it's this exciting intellectual moment where he'll even write to his family about how he's been in Wilhelm Hermann's class, who writes about this experiential notion of Christianity, where the experience of Christ in a Christian community is this sort of evidence of faith rather than a sort of stodgy biblical literalism. And he's shaken by it. And he's saying, I thought that people who didn't believe in a literal resurrection were spiritually dead. Mm-hmm. That was my experience in America. I realized that's not true. Mm-hmm. And he'll say, and contradict himself later in his life as he writes about this autobiographically, that I don't know about all this liberal theology, but I know Hermann's found Christ. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we'll say the exact opposite later, but there's this moment where there's this question about, and we'll even say in letters to my family, I've written too much. You'll think I'm crazy. You'll think I'm being drawn in by this liberalism. It's really this kind of intellectual wheels spinning, but in a good way, which some of us may have had with an academic mentor, where you're in class and suddenly the professor said something, you read this book and you're in a tailspin, but you're suddenly confronted with all these ideas that seem to present possibilities. Yeah. And I think there really were possibilities at this moment.
The letters are incredible. We talked about this before. The letters, because You talk a lot about coded language, too. The coded language from the family seems to suggest an understanding of the nature of this crisis, right? And when you dig into it, and very helpfully, you put some of it in, you italicize some of the text, and it jumps off the page and go, oh my goodness, that's pretty clear to me, right? You know, and it seemed as if it was pretty clear to the family as well.
I think so. There's a couple pieces of correspondence that make this clear, I think. The first is his brother, because he's saying, I'm disqualified for ministry. He's had training, he's had already career searching issues in the past, thought about economics, he's bounced around, there's a lot of family money to go around for education, so he's been able to do this, but now he wants to maybe restart his whole academic career again to do the classics. And his brother says, well, as long as your fault is of a private nature, it's not like you're an alcoholic and are going to show up to the pulpit drunk. So your congregation, and he knows whatever the fault is, he has a sense that it's not a public fault as far as he's concerned. And then later when he has this, what gets blown out of proportion by both his brother and biographers, this one sort of heterosexual or heteronormative romance, his mom writes to him as this is beginning to break down, saying, I know your troubles more deeply than you could ever imagine, and writes about this knowing that he won't find a wife, saying, I wish you would find a wife, but at the same time realizing that this isn't going to happen in a way that feels about as clear as coded language can feel to me, and I think...
It's just amazing, and touching, too, to see that there was a lot of love that came through those letters. Now, I want to say, identity is a big part of this story, but you never go so far as to call Machen gay or bad gay. Why? You know, because you make a strong case with the evidence that you just talk about, but one gets the impression that you're being careful there, and I think I know why, but it'd be helpful to hear why you're being careful there, and in other words, what were the limits?
Yeah, so there's really two things, and the first was realizing that there are still some pretty devoted people within evangelical academia and evangelicalism writ large who would go through these documents with a fine-tooth comb, who would push back on this and wanting to make sure I dotted every I, crossed every T, didn't go beyond the documents for this, because I felt like I could still make a pretty clear argument without venturing anything beyond what was. And where I'm inferring from archival silences, saying I'm doing that. To say, okay, I'm not trying to hide anything, I'm trying to follow where this archive leads, and realizing that that's part of where that could come in. But the other part is, and this is maybe part of where my bigger project is in some ways, because there isn't evidence of a distinct romantic or sexual relationship, there's a way in which this critique is almost leveled at theologically moderate evangelicals, most of all. I think this reads, to me, and I think there's this poignant moment of what is, I think, a tragedy in American religious history. But there's also a way of reading it in an intellectually coherent way from the side of his supporters, and what will be a sort of affiliated with like a side B theology that says, look, yes, Machen in this moment of recognizing his own sexuality comes to this hardline Calvinist theology and would read that in a celebratory tone. And in some ways what I'm arguing is this notion that there is a moment later in evangelical theology at which then there's a backlash to queerness is, I think, wrong chronologically. The notion that really the theological mode, many of the beliefs have an anti-queerness baked in pretty much earlier on than many people have argued. And I think that's really what I wanted to emphasize, that theological implication. And so that's also
There's also this sense that, and I want to open up for some questions from the audience here, but the lives are often curated, and curated by subjects. Subjects create. I came across this in Langston Hughes' life when I was writing my book, Langston Salvation. Sometimes it's hard to get at someone who doesn't want to be known, particularly doesn't want to be known in a particular way. And I think Machen was that way. Machen wanted to present a certain view of himself. And so what you are encouraging us to get through some of that, read the silences. The silences can be read, right? And I think it takes courage to do that kind of historical research, but you're showing us that it's worth it to do that kind of work. But before we get to the questions and answers of the audience, though, we have to talk about unqueering as a methodology, because now that we have queered everything, absolutely, and now you're challenging us to think methodologically about this notion of unqueering. And it's interesting because, again, it can go a couple of ways as I see it. Scholars can do the unqueering, and subjects can do the unqueering. So talk to us a bit about the importance of this approach.
Yeah, so this is something, and I'm really grateful to the editors that pushed me to dive deeper. This was a very sort of bare bones historical archival analysis at first, to push into some queer theory, queer theology a little bit. And I'm still sort of standing very unsteadily on their work, but what I gathered in reading some of this work on queering is that it's, broadly speaking, referring to sort of anti-normative projects that stem from queer gender and sexuality, experiences with queer gender and sexuality, but then often exceed that as well. And realize there are debates within some of the scholarship on this as well, but using that as a broad brushstrokes framework, I in some ways I was like, I'm gonna read this and how does it apply? And it felt like, well, it applies in reverse to my subject here. My subject is having the same encounter with queer sexuality, and my subjects are in response to that, doubling down on a more strictly normative project rather than an anti-normative one. And to me, in some ways this is simple and maybe obvious, but I think the notion is not that there is sort of queer theology and then there is theology, right? Okay. Especially when we're talking about theology in this modern moment, however we want to define it, but however we're going to define it, this moment of an encounter with German liberalism is central for American Protestantism. That there's something active going on where these normative projects that are saying, going back to the quote from Virginia's start, this notion of binaries that's invested in binaries of biblical, unbiblical, constitutional, unconstitutional, American, un-American. All these binaries have what is at times what we would become to think of homosexual, heterosexual as this binary, and has a moral valence to that in a way that really does a lot of work, both in Machen's personal life, but then in evangelical theology going forward. So where that leaves unqueering, in some ways, I was definitely thinking of this as a historical process that happened, right? That this happened and this normative theology comes out of this. There's this quote, the one that I think the most when I think of, in some ways, is when he writes later that in this moment when he's in Germany, that Calvinism's a very comforting doctrine indeed. And to me, that's the line that I keep hearing, that I think is this notion of this is this moment where this doctrine does something in response to his encounter with sexuality and liberalism, with his own sexuality and with liberalism in Germany, in a way that I think is this unqueer, where this is this unqueering moment. But the methodology, and I have to say, like, your question has sparked me to think about this more, but this unqueering methodology means we have had, as you mentioned, we still need more, but we've had scholars in the archive for a while with the glasses to this queering on, where they're looking for these moments where these anti-normative projects stemmed from queerness broadly defined. We also, especially when we're dealing with American Christianity, need to have our eyes peeled. And earlier in the 20th century, or late 19th century than we have before, our eyes peeled for these unqueering projects as well. So in some ways, I think it's a way we need to be, what we need to have our eyes open to in the archive as we're looking. Because I think there's a way in which the story of reaction's been told much later.
Excellent. DG Hart, Daryl Hart is one of my professors. I'm sitting here wondering what Daryl will think about.
So to share, I realized the article had been published when he tweeted about it. So,
oh, he did tweet about it. Okay, there you go.
Not approvingly, but this is how I realized the article had finally come out.
You have to know something about DG Hart to know why this is fascinating to us. But great professor, and Machen scholar. Yeah. So. Help me keep time here, but I think we want to open up now. I'm sure there are other questions for Austin about the paper.
Back again. Hello.
Hello, Cairo.
Hello. I was wondering if you could tell us, maybe this is like a professional interest, and I'm sorry, this is my biases, but I was wondering if you could tell us more about your archive story, about going to the place, and what were the staff like, and what's the collection like? Is it manageable? Is it unwieldy? And if you want, you don't have to go into it because this is like being recorded and stuff. But if there's like, if there's an item or two that didn't make it into the paper that still rings with you, that you want to talk about. But I'm curious about your archive journey.
Yeah. So this is a great question. So the interesting thing, and I don't want to speculate. So the archives are at Westminster Seminary, which Machen founded when he left Princeton after the moderates, who he referred to as the indifferentists, won over control of Princeton Seminary in the 1920s. So he founds Westminster Seminary, and his papers are still there. It's in Philadelphia. As far as I know, there's relatively good access for scholars, but it's not the most easy collection to deal with. You kind of request small folders that are organized sometimes in different ways at a time. I know they're working on a project there to get them more organized. For this paper, a lot of the most important sources are in Machen's own, not particularly legible handwriting. There were some documents I didn't have where I emailed people. I will say I got pretty good at reading his handwriting after a long time, but sometimes staring at words that I knew were important for a long time on end. But the interesting thing is there was definitely an interest in why I was writing about Machen. My sense is that for some people who've looked at his archive, that Hart's biography of Machen is the conclusive academic word on Machen. I think both in this article and in my dissertation, which has many sources not in here, but more on the side of politics and theology, I think there's a lot more to say about Machen, more than my advisor will let me submit in the dissertation. But there's so much to be said. Interestingly, a decent amount has been made of his politics around race. He had a family with a deep Southern background. He had on his mom's side a large Georgia plantation, and he sort of thought about this time, this antebellum plantation life was his, in many ways, ideal of the America that had been lost to modernity. And he expresses racist views throughout his life. His brother is fighting to literally challenge the 15th Amendment and black suffrage in Maryland, and he's cheering his brother on. So it seemed to me that Westminster is maybe particularly interested in how people will review those documents. I don't think there was any thought about Machen's sexuality in the archive whatsoever. And so I think that was something where the perspective that someone would have on that wasn't, I don't think, on many people's radar. Although in talking to now people, and William could tell you from talking to some of his sources for his research, there have been rumors about Machen's sexuality or coded ways about talking about it within his circles when he was alive through to evangelicals today. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like no one was thinking about this or discussing it, but I don't think it was something that it was a facet of the archives they were aware of in a way that I think was pretty different from other aspects of Machen's life.
Another person? You can take that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this incredibly compelling and very convincing paper. I wanted to ask a question about sexuality as a category of historical analysis. So I was really intrigued by the sort of alternative reading you speculated on the part of Machen's contemporary sort of theological descendants. So if the idea of a sexuality is a thing that all people have, that's sort of an intrinsic, component of a personality, is a fairly modern convention and emerging around this time, and Machen himself rejects this as a framework, so far as we can tell, in that he speaks about, a moral failing or a personal, these different ways of talking about it. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit, both intellectually and sort of ethically, to your choice to use sexuality as an interpretive framework. It's clear from your evidence that there's definitely something there that, the patterns of behavior across his life and the coded language clearly evokes. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the choice to use the framework of sexuality to interpret it, and whether sort of secular or religious frameworks that might offer alternatives, how that might lead you to interpret the evidence in other ways.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's one that I think is a little bit fraught, where in some ways I'm speaking a language my subject doesn't. And one of the things that's really interesting, and I think part of why I wanted to use this framework, is the ways in which this crisis moment that I focus on in Germany in 1904 and 1905, the ways in which Machen narrates this later. And it's narrated as an intellectual moment. This notion that there is anything personal morality is left out of Machen's telling. And I think it's a way also in which he then sort of goes after this German liberal theology, saying it's not real Christianity. We'll say straight out, counter to what he said then, and his own personal encounter falls out of this story. And there's a way in which I think that's been picked up by some of his biographers, and it's this heroic moment where he's tempted by liberal theology and shuts it down through, and they're telling, the act of the sort of the century of rational Calvinism that Princeton had to offer was a stronger call, and his own family's religion is a stronger call than that. And so I think that's seeing what the narrative looks like with sexuality out of it, and seeing how much that didn't match up with the theological history, is part of why I think I was more willing to go there and use this framework that I think more accurately describes what's going on. And I think that's where I found it most useful, is to say, and when I found, it's really his only autobiographical writing, to be like, there's this mismatch. Not that, we would all have a mismatch if we tried to remember something from that many years ago, but there's this dramatic mismatch in the way this theological story gets told, that I think that's where this is useful to understand what's actually happening, and a needed category to understand what's going on.
One more.
All right. Well, maybe what we'll do right now as we close it out is to just, just where you landed there, I'm compelled to ask about the takeaway here. What must we as scholars or lay people take into account with unqueering, with this story? I mean, because again, I get the sense of there is something you're also teaching us about a particular way of doing history or queer history, and there's something to be learned through this story. I mean, take us home. Where do we go from here? We read your work, and Machen scholars read your work. What are they? What are you asking them to think about or to consider about this life and about how to do this kind of history?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's two real things, and one is, and where you pick this up, is to hopefully, and even I think in the paper I referenced some other works that I see as doing this sort of historical telling, this telling of these unqueering theological moments, is to hopefully see more people take those up. in other facets, other institutions where this happened, other ways it's still happening, recognizing this framework and hopefully doing it better than I did and more than I did and in more places. So that's one thing where I hope it goes. And then I think where it goes in my work and where it goes in how I'm thinking about evangelicalism. And this is something where I'm so glad to have read sort of queer theorists like Sedgwick who are talking about sexuality and modernity, and I'm already, and this will be very open-ended because I don't know, but I've been repeatedly wrestling with this concept of modernity and the ways in which evangelicalism operates. My working argument is that it's this sort of alternative modernity. It's this logical, rational, epistemologically ambitious whole, but it's completely different than the whole that the modernists, the liberals, even today, what we, are working with. And so I think realizing how much sexuality is a key and oftentimes instigating component in this confrontation with a different vision of modernity, I think is really important. And I think it also gets to this fact that theology, politics, your normative claims, they're not separated. And in some ways, it's an argument, in some ways, a way to look back to say this is woven really deeply into the fabric of evangelicalism. So for those who are more invested in the project of reforming it, I guess I'm a bit skeptical that moment can be found in really the post-Machen time period for in many ways. And I think when it does, it has to do something that's pretty dramatically different than what came out of this story.
Austin, congratulations. This is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful piece of scholarship. So thank you for your work. This is absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much to LGBT-RAN and Union for having this. And I mean, it's just a huge privilege to be here, a huge honor to have an award named after Virginia in particular is just incredibly meaningful and an exciting opportunity. So thank you so much.
You're here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just some quick notes of appreciation. Again, we've also expressed much appreciation to Union Theological Seminary Dean Pak, Assistant Grace Hahn, Jordan McDaniel and the communication staff for helping pull all this together, Brendan Nee and the Gay Caucus, who were so great, who've helped provide the reception, which you can enjoy here. I want to just acknowledge publicly the jury members for the Mollenkott Award, who are Joanne Carlson Brown, Johari Jabir, and Jillian Frank. A shout out to Deborah Morrison, could not be here tonight. Deborah was Virginia's longtime partner and BFF, who really was a prime driving force in setting up this memorial for Virginia. Deborah's enjoying some time on vacation with friends, so we are thinking of her. I want to thank Jacob and Asadi on the LGBTQ-RAN staff who provide the live streaming. Thanks to all of you who are watching this via live stream. And just to acknowledge just the LGBTQ-RAN personnel here, Riot Mueller and myself are on staff. You met Marnie Warner and Brendan Fay on the board of directors. Raise hands there. And then we have advisors, Caro Brattenober, Andrew Patty, and Derek McQueen are part of the advisory team. Thank you for being here. Please stay around, enjoy the reception, meet Austin, have fun times talking together. Let's have a good evening together. Thank you.